Some attack helos are born lucky. Some are born very lucky. Some are born practically tripods. The fact is, not all 30mm cannons are nearly the same, neither in power nor in roll. Today I'm exploring some of these differences. A lot of the numbers you'll casually find on the internet are grossly simplified, oversold, or straight up wrong. I've tried sifting through most of these. I'll timestamp a big caveat near the end about the numbers and the complexities of ballistics. For 30mm cannons, on the extreme, you have the famous AT&C Thunderbolt 2 or Warthog. Not an attack helicopter, I know. Use the timestamps to skip ahead if you like, but the GAU 8 cannon is a good point of reference of what a 30mm could be. The jet's pretty much built around the 6-meter long GAU 8 Avenger, with a 7 barrel slightly offset to the left so the firing barrel is always on the center line. It can do up to 4,200 rounds per minute, but they've standardized it to one fire rate of 3,900, which speeds up from 50 rounds a second for the first second to 70 rounds a second thereafter. Depending on the mission need, it typically fires a combat mix of 5 armor-piercing incendiary depleted uranium rounds for every high explosive incendiary round, which fly with slightly different trajectories, so at a distance and angle they might not hit the same spot. It can produce more recoil than a single engine's thrust, though it's used in such short bursts that stalling is not a concern. In its design, they've had to compensate for exhaust gas from the cannon blinding the cockpit with residue or flaming out engines, and unlike the attack helos I'll get to soon, its aluminium alloy casings aren't ejected, so they don't fly into the engine intakes and the ballast weight is retained. To save a lot of time, the ammo is loaded into the Warthog with a custom ammunition loading adapter ALA or Dragon cart that feeds off the A10's hydraulics and also offloads cartridges, loading 2 ammo cans of 1,150 rounds, just shy of the maximum 1,174 rounds. With a standard 2-second burst, this gives it 9 trigger pulls worth of ammunition. Now it has destroyed older tanks with less advanced armor. As a jet, the A10's own airspeed adds mentionable increase to the projectile velocity and allows it to circle a tank more easily to attack from the weaker rear or roof, and to dive to get a narrow cone of fire on the target. Even so, while the guide could knock out sensors and such, it's not the go-to weapon for a catastrophic kill on a modern main battle tank. You'd use guided air-to-ground missiles or bombs, or an anti-tank guided missile if you can. As for the stats, the round includes the casing, primer and such, so it's much heavier and longer than the 173mm projectile it launches. Milliradian spread is how tightly projectiles land near one another. So 5 milliradians means that at 1k distance, 80% of the rounds will land within 5 meters of one another. Of course, all these rounds could still be inaccurate and have landed far from the intended target, so this is just shot grouping. These stats are often from ideal situations, probably against a stand-up target, rather than the angled dirt. Circular error probable, or probability, or CEP, lists from a 1k hover how many meters 50% of the rounds should land near one another. It's another measure of a spread, or shot grouping, not necessarily accuracy. Obviously, firing from shorter distances narrows the distance into a tighter spread. You might not always want a tight spread. If your accuracy is off and the rounds don't land where they're aimed at, then having a few rounds land wide might still hit the target. Though of course it does increase the safe range for collateral. It also means aiming at a group, you might not have to fire on separate targets, though it might also mean firing multiple bursts and needing to evaluate the results every time to see if all the targets were taken out. Either way, do not fixate on any individual numbers. The results and the real effect gets more complicated. Now, unlike the Warthog, a helicopter is usually expected to carry its own weight without the luxury of forward airspeed. It just can't carry nearly enough as a jet using long runways. For example, The AH-64 Apache heavy attack helicopter also features a 30mm cannon, but it's single barrel rather than 7, and you can see in the stats the extreme difference from the A-10's longer rounds. Even reduced, it said it rattles the belly deck plates, your teeth, and the helmet display while it's firing. You can see the powerful recoil this thing puts out, pushing a helo around a little from the trimmed harbor. The max range is over 4Ks, though the effective range is 1.7 kilometers or closer. It's known as an area weapon system. Likely its design is less from the modern day footage you may see, but in a time the most likely threat was a Soviet horde of soldiers massing in the forests of Europe, where this cannon could spray the whole area and suppress a wide range of troops, pinning them in place until they're getting taken out by other forces. I'm not going to show you kill cams, but if you go looking, you'll see the majority of footage is from 1 kilometers, maybe plus minus 200 meters, with the impacts spread in a wide area, wider than 3 milliradians would suggest. That said, the spread looks maybe ideal for aiming center mass for a group of individuals walking slightly spaced 600 to 800 meters. It has training rounds and could fire the M799 explosive rounds, though the latter was never really produced for deployment. In combat, it uses the single feed of M789 high-explosive dual-purpose rounds. These HEDPs have both armor-piercing and explosive effects without traces. The impact sends shards out up to 4 meters in a butterfly pattern, with an advertised kill radius for standing targets about 5 to 10 feet out. As with all explosives, this is potential, not a guarantee. You can see footage where a round lands within a meter of someone without them even stumbling. While grenades like the M67 are old casings and explosive composition, not even the Warthog's huge 30mm carry nearly the same explosive content as a conventional M67 grenade. Especially if hitting softer sand, a shell buries itself slightly, reducing the fragments going towards targets even more, which is reduced even further if the targets are prone. Of course, 30mm shells can be accurately delivered at high fire rates, much further than a grenade can be thrown, and it won't roll into a ditch. And with the advantage of an attack helo, you can evaluate the effect and fire again if necessary. So individually, a round won't match a conventional grenade, but a good burst on target can have good effect. The M789's high explosive, anti-tank or heat effect will tune to most infantry fighting vehicles, and its armor-piercing ability won't reduce much of a range. Unlike the fixed mounting on the A-10, where the pilot needs to point the plane on the target, the chain gun swivels, guided by the pilot helmet looking at the target or slewing head control, compensating for distance and target movement if needed. The firing rate can be around 625 rounds per minute, which it spools up to in 0.2 seconds, but in the field it may be reduced to 550 rounds per minute to ease on maintenance, which is similar to the fire rate of a single GAR-8 barrel. The chain gun name refers to the linkless shells fed into the magazine with one piece of metal. It uses lighter aluminium cases, and it can carry 1,200 rounds, about 1,100 in the magazine and about 90 in the chain feed. But often in modern day, Apaches go the reduced 300 rounds to make space for the internal Robbie fuel tank. Overall, a flexible weapon used on soft targets may be 1K out, maybe after armor and threats have been dealt with by Hellfires and significant concentrations have been strafed with rockets. In situations where there aren't threats for the helo, or the threats are unaware of the helo, this cannon appears to be very effective in providing up-close support to infantry and other ground forces. Then there's the EC-665 Eurocopter Tiger, a lighter attack helo. Outside the cannonless German variant, most Tigers have the Giat 30M781 cannon. While the baffles might make it look very different from the chain gun, which has the wire strike cutters and guide bars, they are remarkably similar. with flexible angles, single feed of dual-purpose tracerless 30x113mm electrical priming shells. However, the heavier steel-cased semi-armor piercing high-explosive incendiary rounds pack less explosives and a little less penetration power than the Apache's M789 rounds. And they fire at a lower velocity but higher potential fire rate. The other rounds are mainly used for training or additional fuse safeties. Maybe there are other differences like jam resistance, fusing safety, or effectiveness of the fragmentation, but I couldn't find any further reliable information on this cannon. Overall, it appears to be very similar in weight and effect to the Apache's cannon. Early Hinds, and many variants of it, used 50 cal to 23mm turrets. Then they found that some lighter targets in cover were too hard to take on with the lighter calibers, but not worth the rockets, which is when they made their Mi-24P variant. This mounted the GSH-30 2K cannon and reinforced part of the airframe to prevent the recoil shaking the avionics apart. It veers away from the turret idea completely and fixes two giant barrels along the nose, similar to the cannon the Su-25 jet, but with a heavier mount, higher velocity, and water cooling. The rounds and projectiles are almost double the weight of the 30x113 rounds, including double the explosive charge, but they're also shot at a much stronger velocity. The projectiles have an almost flat trajectory out to 1K. It's single feed and might carry a combat mix of up to 250 high explosive incendiary, high explosive tracer, and armor-piercing tracer rounds. While closer to the 18's rounds in length and velocity, the shells have heavier steel casings, cheaper penetrators, and reduced explosive filler with less armor penetration as a result. And while that fire rate seems like it gets closer to the Warthog, with the Warthog the pilot might feel like they stepped on the brakes when firing, but won't necessarily buck around or lose their aim. With the Hind, firing on high produces a significant kick and depletes the ammo in seconds. The penetration shown here is elevated as it's given for a jet flying 388 knots, which adds significantly to the velocity, likely for the Su-25's cannon, so take it with a pinch of salt. It's still likely to mess up most infantry fighting vehicles, but not punch clean through modern main battle tanks. Downside is of course its weight and recoil. It's twice as heavy as the Tiger or Apache cannons, just the cannon, never mind the weight of the rounds. That's weight that could have gone to other systems, armor, or maneuverability. On the Mi-24P, it's mounted near the nose, completely fixed, and aimed purely by flying towards the target, like the Warthog, needing to line up targets before flying in, and thus less capable to snipe out spaced targets. It was often used first delivering rockets, then using the cannon to inflict further damage. Given the Hind's flight characteristics makes it really fast, good for shock and all, but less comfortable in firing from a hover, doing attack passes like a plane suits it well. The cannon rounds are said to be fairly reliable, though barrel life is rather short, possibly related to the high fire rate, doing about double the rounds per minute for each barrel, compared to say the Warthog's 557 rounds per minute per barrel. Later versions of the rounds would have extended barrel life a bit by using the plastic instead of copper rings. Variants of this cannon and the rounds are used on multiple jets. Then there's the monster Schupanov 2A42 cannon, mounted on the Ka-50 Black Shark and the Ka-52 Alligator. On the Shark, the beast has a 2.4 meter barrel and over 3 meters in total length, coming in at 115 Ks, and if you include the hydraulic NPPU-80 mount, a massive 280 Ks. It was designed for the BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle launched in 1980, so it's not intentionally made as an aircraft weapon. With a high fire rate, excessive smoke would fill the BMP cabin, and its ventilator couldn't keep up. But that's not an issue for the helicopters. Most aircraft weapons are designed for air cooling with recommended breaks between 1 to 2 second bursts. The 2A42 was born down low in the dust, molded by it. So being low, down in the murk where attack helicopters dwell, doesn't bother it, and it's fairly tough against jamming, dust and temperatures. If needed, it could fire off the full 460 rounds of the Black Shark without cooling breaks between bursts in low rate of fire. For high rate of fire, 50 rounds in short bursts with another 50 rounds after that, and no more to prevent lasting damage on the barrel's lifespan. The rounds are comparable to the Hind's GSH ones, but fired at substantially higher velocity and using gas or percussion priming instead of electrical. The 2842 and its variants are used widely now, and the munitions are compatible with many other ground platforms like BMPs, BTR-82s, Tunguskas, and BMP-T Terminators, to name but a few. It's not compatible with electrical priming naval munitions though. It's dual feed with separate ammunition boxes, allowing the pilot to seamlessly switch between armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds dedicated to the target at hand. The high-explosive rounds have double explosive weight than some of the 130mm projectiles, each producing about 134 fragments with a majority between 0.5 and 2 gram fragments, about 5mm in diameter, likely going out to almost 9 meters. The rear Hi-X ammo box is typically loaded with 240 rounds, with 4 fragmentation Hi-X incendiary OFZ shells for every 1 fragmentation OT tracer round. There are variants of high-explosive incendiary rounds with tracer that only burns a sixth as long, but packs almost 39 grams of explosives. However, the standard OT tracer round that makes for every 5th round in the Hi-X feed only packs 11 grams of explosives for a 10 to 14 second tracer that burns off mass during flight. So these rounds may overshoot the other rounds at a little longer ranges. Given the Hind's tracers burn a fraction of this time, it may indicate a difference in intent, with the 2A42 rounds intended to be used at a far greater distance with these long tracers. The OFC rounds fuse primes 20 to 100 meters off the muzzle and has a 15 millisecond delay. That means firing on personnel at 1K, it only detonates after traveling 10 centimeters further into a soft body, depending on velocity and angle, with the fuse itself almost 7 centimeters long. It slightly worsens the explosive effect if it hits the ground, but it makes it better against lightly skinned vehicles, knocking down trees, shattering sandbags, or tearing chunks out of a 10 centimeter concrete wall reinforced with rebar and an extra layer of brick facade. The 220 BT armor-piercing rounds in the front ammo box lack an incendiary component and have a double conical tip. Of the 400 gram projectile, the steel core alone is 375 grams. Each round has a tracer burning for about 3.5 seconds or 2.3 Ks. Ground-based vehicles with the 2A42s loaded the 3U BR8 BPS with a plastic sabot, larger velocity and tungsten alloy penetrator that could go through 33 mils of armor at 500 meters. And then there's the Bulgarian munitions like the Rapid C armor-piercing incendiary, which could supposedly penetrate 50 mils of rolled homogeneous steel at 500 meters. Soviet tests with the BMP-2s inflicted weapon kills on a T-55 and sensor and mobility kill on T-72 with just 24 rounds from 1.2 kilometers. But the original rounds of the Black Shark, it's still not going to be good enough to inflict catastrophic kills in most situations on a tank. The armor-piercing rounds are rated to attack light armor from 2Ks and soft skin targets from 4Ks with a high explosive. Mounted near the center of gravity, this cannon has supreme accuracy of 1.2 to 1.3 milliradians. It's said the pilots regularly have 50% of the rounds land on a 1.5 by 1.5 meter target at 1K, which sort of aligns with another reference to the odds of hitting a 1.42 meter tall M113 IFV at 1.5 Ks, being 55%. Historically, the Ka-52, which has the same base airframe and cannon as the Ka-50, dominates the aviator darts competitions for accuracy over the Hind variants and Mi-28s. This might only be for the low fire rates, possibly the high fire rates might spray more wildly. Official results from testing of BMPs indicated 24 plus rounds of AP needed to defeat an IFV at 2 km, 24 rounds of HE on an anti-tank infantry squad in trenches at 1.5 Ks, and 29 rounds to wipe out an entrenched infantry squad at 1.5 Ks. In 95, a small upgrade was done to the cannons, replacing 10% of the components with a field repair that could increase its guaranteed barrel lifespan from 4,000 to 6,000 rounds to 9,000 rounds. Now the price for all that force? Over 4 tons of recoil. That's why they mounted it close to the center of gravity and the strongest part of the airframe near the gearbox. This greatly assists with the recoil and absorbing vibrations. The other factor is the weight. Even just the 460 rounds weigh more than 1,200 rounds of the Apache chain gun. Unlike the Hind's GSH cannon, it has a small range of motion to track targets and compensate for bullet drop with laser ranging, guided by the helmet sight or slewing at, so it can fire comfortably from a hover, and in an attack pass it could spray or target multiple separate spaced targets. Its use is also quite different from the Apache or Tiger. It can suppress an area with large explosives from much further out, which was used in combat by BMPs to suppress likely hiding areas. It can also snipe out individual targets with relative certainty and less cycles of waiting to confirm impacts and kills before firing another burst. Then again, it can just keep firing rather than doing short bursts. It also outranges some of the lighter AAA systems, so it can be used to effectively take out such threats without resorting to guided missiles. However, the small range of motion means it can't suppress targets or threats that surprise the helo off the side effectively, so it's less suited for flying in orbit around somewhere, ready to assist other forces should the situation develop. Also, if you need to get close anyway to identify targets as hostiles, then the range is less relevant. Lastly, there's a lot of weight that Tiger and Apache didn't need to design for to carry that weight. Fixing cannon to the center of gravity with such a small range of motion, is it really necessary? Fortunately, there's a helicopter to answer that question. The Mi-28 Havoc also uses the 2A42, but placed on a giant NPPU-28 turret near the nose, with 2 ammo boxes for the different munition types inside the turret, either side of the barrel. It can fire off bore side like the Tiger or Apache, but compared to the Kamovs, it sacrifices accuracy, recoil, and munitions capacity to do so. It can only carry 250 rounds total, compared to the Ka-50 and 52's 460 rounds. Additionally, the turret is very bulky, and it said the Ka-50 with its coaxial rotors could yaw over, turning the whole helicopter to bear in the same speed as the early Mi-28's turret could rotate. As for accuracy in the tender competitions, the Ka-50 scored 1.6 milliradians versus the Mi-28A's 4.6. One could assume in the tests the cannon would have been fired in the more optimal forward-facing conditions, but perhaps the cannon's recoil, if fired sideways, didn't help. Functionally, it can be used like the Tiger and Apache's cannons, just more explosive power, range, and velocity. The cost, of course, is the Mi-28 would have to compromise on some of the weight, or as the case, gone with a heavier airframe and engines to compensate for a cannon munitions that's maybe 5 times heavier than the typical 300 round Apache setup. Now, there's a lot that goes into the flight and penetration of ballistics, the design, quality control, materials, how the recoil is used and dealt with, etc. I've pieced these details from multiple sources, and I've tried looking past the manufacturer numbers with advertisement bias, and some of the Wikipedia mistakes you see repeated everywhere, and the heavier outliers. But I guarantee I haven't filtered out all the misinformation. Let me know in the comments if you've come across different numbers, or other interesting anecdotes that puts these weapons into perspective. If you're interested, the description below has a lot more on the assumptions, obscurities and facets I just couldn't find enough reliable data to compare. I've read they might replace the 3-decade-old depleted uranium rounds in the A10 with tungsten, which will be denser than the depleted uranium but doesn't sharpen in the same way during impact and doesn't quite penetrate as much, but might be much more readily available to the US than it was during the Cold War. There also have been investigations into making the A10's API and HE rounds have the same flight path, so everything hits almost the same spot. For the M230, tests were done to change it into percussion priming with some marginal benefits, adding tracers and changing it to dual feed with selectable ammo instead of the one-size-fits-all rounds. The 2A42 might also be using plastic driver bands now to extend the barrel life. And with all of these, there might have been software upgrades to increase the cannon's ability to track, as well as compensate and stabilize for the recoil. I can't tell you which, if any of these upgrades, have been implemented, or if they were just random tests. So what those aircraft are mounting today, or will be in the near future, might perform differently than my comparison here. Which cannon's better? Depends on the situation, threat, and what you need or want to achieve with the cannon. How good or important the cannon is also depends on the aircraft's sensors and systems, crew training, and how that aircraft is deployed along with the other units and intel. The cannon is dead weight if you're in the wrong place, can't spot the target, or can't damage it with cannon fire. I hope this video was informative. Even in the small subset category of attack helicopters, the 30mm cannons can be very different in form and function. This is Volk. Cheers.